The European Union has just made one of the most consequential financial decisions of the modern era, and almost no one understands how dangerous it really is. At first glance, it looked like a bold act of justice, a decisive move, a powerful signal to Moscow that aggression carries consequences. But beneath the headlines, beneath the applause, Europe crossed a line that may haunt it for decades. What I'm about to explain is not just about Russia or Ukraine. This is about the slow collapse of trust in the post-World War II financial system and how Europe may have triggered its own economic decline. Let's begin with what actually happened. After Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Western governments froze roughly $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves. These were not private assets. They were not owned by oligarchs. They were sovereign reserves, money held by Russia's central bank inside European and American financial institutions. This was unprecedented. Never before had the West frozen the reserves of a major nuclear-armed power at this scale. For 2 years, those assets remained frozen. Russia demanded their return. The West refused. But freezing is not the same as confiscating. Turning those reserves into cash for Ukraine required a legal justification that simply did not exist. European legal experts warned that outright seizure would violate international law. They warned it would destroy the principle that central bank reserves are inviolable. They warned it would destroy the principle that central bank reserves are inviolable. They warned it would create a precedent that could never be undone. Those warnings were ignored. In late 2025, the European Council approved the seizure of $15 billion from the frozen Russian reserves and transferred the money into a Ukraine reconstruction fund. The legal argument was creative, bordering on reckless. The assets were labeled reparations for Russian aggression. Politically, it was celebrated as a triumph. European leaders congratulated themselves. Media outlets framed the decision as moral clarity. Politicians rushed to claim credit for standing up to Russia. But what came next shocked even Europe's most experienced policymakers. Russia did not respond with missiles. They did not launch cyber attacks. They did not cut off energy supplies outright. Instead, they did something far more devastating. They rewrote the rules of global finance. Russia's retaliation came in 3 waves, and each wave was more damaging than the last. Within 48 hours, Moscow announced the nationalization of all European corporate assets inside Russia. No negotiations, no compensation. BP's stake in Rosneft erased, Shell's Russian operations seized, Total Energies projects confiscated, Société Générale's banking operations taken over, German automotive plants belonging to Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes nationalized, pharmaceutical facilities, food processing plants, retail chains, infrastructure projects, patents, intellectual property, everything. The total value exceeded $120 billion, 8 times more than what Europe seized. European boardrooms descended into chaos. Shareholders demanded answers. Russia then announced a new rule. All remaining energy exports to Europe would be priced exclusively in rubles or yuan. No euros accepted. This was not a supply cutoff. Russia wasn't harming its own revenues. Instead, it forced Europe into a humiliating position. If you want energy, you must abandon your currency. European buyers now had to acquire rubles or yuan through Russian or Chinese financial intermediaries. That meant fees, exchange rate risk, loss of transparency, and dependency on non-Western systems. But the deeper impact was psychological. The euro, assumed to be a global reserve currency, was being rejected by a major commodity exporter. Countries that needed Russian energy had to sell euros to buy rubles. This increased downward pressure on the euro. The ruble, supposedly destroyed by sanctions, strengthened. China benefited enormously. Energy buyers using yuan had to hold yuan reserves. This accelerated yuan internationalization at the euro's expense. The European Central Bank watched helplessly as energy importers dumped euros, weakening the currency and importing inflation. The message was unmistakable. Your currency no longer commands trust. Then came the move that truly panicked European capitals. Russia announced the creation of the BRICS Plus Reserve Fund, a $150 billion financial pool backed by Russia, China, India, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others. Its purpose was simple: protect countries from Western financial weaponization. Think of it as an alternative IMF, designed specifically for nations worried their assets could be frozen or seized. But the real innovation was structural. Assets deposited into the fund were held across multiple non-Western jurisdictions. No single country controlled custody. No Western court could seize them. The assets were legally engineered to be seizure-proof. China contributed 50 billion, Russia committed 30 billion, Saudi Arabia and the UAE added 25 billion each, India, Iran, and others filled out the rest. This wasn't about money. This was about trust. Countries around the world asked themselves one question: if Europe seized Russian reserves, what stops them from seizing ours? The answer was obvious: nothing. Saudi Arabia quietly reduced exposure to European assets. The UAE shifted sovereign wealth funds toward Asia. China accelerated de-Euroization. Even neutral countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, Mexico, began discussing diversification away from Europe. Central banks and sovereign wealth funds hold trillions in European assets. Even a 10% reallocation means hundreds of billions in selling pressure. European bond yields rose. Borrowing costs increased, precisely when Europe needed massive spending for Ukraine aid and energy transitions. The ECB faced an impossible choice: print money and reignite inflation, or allow yields to rise and governments to struggle. They chose a middle path that restored neither confidence nor stability. Germany was hit hardest. German manufacturers had invested deeply in Russia. The automotive sector alone lost an estimated $30 billion. Plants built over decades vanished overnight. Political backlash exploded. Business lobbies demanded compensation. France followed. Total Energies faced shareholder lawsuits. Societe Generale wrote off billions. Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, every major European economy suffered losses. Energy politics fractured EU unity. Countries like Hungary adapted quickly, opening ruble accounts and securing cheaper energy. Others refused on principle and paid higher prices. The EU split along energy dependency lines, exactly what Russia wanted. The real damage wasn't immediate losses. It was the precedent. If Europe could seize Russian reserves, it could seize Chinese assets during a Taiwan crisis, or Saudi assets during an oil dispute, or anyone's assets in a future conflict. Central banks exist to minimize risk. Assets that can be seized. Ironically, China, once viewed as risky, now appeared safer than Europe for many non-Western countries. For decades, Europe benefited from its reputation as a neutral financial haven. That reputation is now gone. European financial centers are no longer seen as impartial. Property rights now appear conditional. Rule of law looks subordinate to geopolitics. The euro's reserve currency ambitions were built on trust. Trust has been shattered. Once lost, it is almost impossible to restore. China emerged as the biggest winner. Every euro sold went somewhere, often into yuan-denominated assets. China's alternative payment systems gained years of momentum overnight. Russia filed cases across international courts. They will likely lose many, but that's not the goal. The goal is to establish a legal record showing that international law bends to power. That property rights depend on political alignment. This makes global finance less stable, which hurts Europe far more than Russia. Privately, European officials admit the mistake. Publicly, they cannot. Reversal would look weak. Escalation risks disaster, so paralysis sets in. Meanwhile, capital continues to leave. Ukraine received $15 billion. Europe paid hundreds of billions in lost investment, higher borrowing costs, inflation, and political instability. By 2026, bond yields are projected to be 150 basis points higher due to confidence loss alone. That translates to $500–600 billion in extra interest payments over a decade. 5 times what Ukraine received. European voters feel the pain. Anti-EU parties gain strength. Russia adapts, Europe weakens. After World War I, harsh reparations destabilized Germany and poisoned international relations for decades. This may follow the same path, celebrated at first, regretted later, impossible to undo. For 80 years, global finance rested on 3 principles: sovereign asset protection, neutral financial infrastructure, rule of law over politics. Europe shattered all 3. The system will not return to what it was, and it was avoidable. Europe could have frozen the assets indefinitely, used them as leverage, waited for negotiated settlement, sought UN legitimacy. Instead, they chose confiscation. It looked strong, it felt righteous, but history will remember it as the moment Europe traded long-term credibility for short-term applause and paid the price.